Hi everyone, I'm Freddie, and today I'll be giving out some book recommendations on books that have animal companions as either like a major plot point or a minor plot point for one or more of the characters in the books. This is like a sweet spot for me. I love this. I've always had a weakness for characters who have some kind of animal companionship as a part of their character. It started already when I was a kid, and I don't think anyone who knew me growing up were surprised when I decided to study to be a veterinarian. It was practically foreshadowed in my reading and viewing tastes throughout my life. I was a horse girl growing up, and I read books like Heartland by Lauren Brooke and The Black Stallion by Walter Farley. Love those books. I still own them. I watched and played Pokemon all the time. I would argue that is also animal companion. And then I moved from there to some of the books that I'll be mentioning today, and I kind of kept going. I still love when I run across animal companions in books. Here comes my animal companion feeling ignored. Hey, Szechuan. I would pick her up and show her to the camera, but she hates that. So now she jumped on my chair, but I don't think you can see her anyways. Anyways, I'm pretty sure there's no chance that I'm not going to forget some books that I have read or books that I've just heard about and haven't read that have animal companions. So feel free to leave any books that you know in the comments, because that can both help other people and also me. I would not mind getting recommendations for other books. I will say some of these books do have like animal death trigger warnings, so be sure to look that up if you need to. But let's just get right into the recommendations. We're going to start with a series that's quite well known that I've recently started, but I haven't finished yet, so I can't speak to like the whole of the series, but I thought it was still worth mentioning because it's part of what made me think of making this video. And that would be the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. This is an epic fantasy series of 14 books following several different characters, one of which I definitely feel like fits the animal companion idea I have here. And in the series, at least in the first 3 books, I don't know what's going to come down the line, but so far we've met a couple of people who can communicate with wolves and kind of have a bond to them, giving them a companionship with wolves. One of them basically lives with a pack of wolves in the wild, kind of gave up on humans, but he does still interact with humans, but for the most part he lives with wolves. And another character who we follow much more is just learning that he has this ability to communicate with wolves and kind of coming to terms with it and figuring it out. And he's especially struggling with how it sets him apart from everyone else, because it's not like a well-known thing. It's a super old ability that no one really knows about anymore. So since I haven't finished the series, I can't say anything about what's going to happen later and whether it still fits. But for the first 3 books at least, I feel like it fits, and I really enjoy them. I am continuing on the series. I just haven't gotten to it yet because I just picked up the next 3 books today. But yeah, I would definitely recommend for now the first 3 books in the Wheel of Time series. Next up, we have a book series that I will never stop recommending to people, and that would be The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. I love these books so much. Now, if you're not familiar, this is also epic fantasy. It's 16 books, but it's divided into 4 trilogies and 1 quartet, where 3 of the trilogies mostly follow one character, while the others follow different characters in different places. But there is like a through-going storyline, but you can read some of them a bit out of order. This that I'm holding up here is The Assassin's Apprentice, which is the first book in the Farseer trilogy, which is chronologically and also by publication the first book in the Realm of the Elderlings. Now, in this world, there are a couple of different types of magic. One of them is called the wit, or the old blood, and this magic gives you the ability to like communicate, sense animals, and also bond with animals. And the 3 trilogies that we have, where we follow basically one character, starts with the Farseer trilogy, and we follow Fitz Chivalry, who is a royal bastard who has this old blood magic. He uses the magic to both communicate with animals throughout, but he also has some very important animal companions throughout his story. We're basically starting with him as at 6 years old and then following him throughout his life, pretty much. And I could go and get some of the other books in the series, but honestly, I'm just going to keep holding this one, because I will also mention that there are also dragons in the Realm of the Elderlings who have the ability to communicate with some humans, which is especially important in the Rainwild Chronicles, which is the quartet in the series. As I mentioned, the Realm of the Elderlings can be read out of order. Some people say start with Farseer, some say start with Liveship. I personally started with Farseer, and that's where I recommend people start, also because it is chronologically the first part. Now, you can start with Liveship Traders, and you're not gonna get spoiled for a lot because it does take place in a different country and a different region, but there are mentions of things that happen in the first trilogy. So if you want to be completely spoiler free, you should start with Farseer. Some people also start with Rainwild. That definitely has spoilers, but it is the one where the dragons are the most in focus, I think. So if that's what you're here for, go for that one. But that one definitely has spoilers for the earlier series. As I mentioned, I absolutely love this series. I recommend it anytime I get the chance. Hobb writes incredibly vivid, incredibly deep characters that I just cannot help getting very emotionally attached to, and she does a great job like exploring the characters and how, like, the consequences of certain things happening. I also think that the world, the plot, the characters, incredibly fascinating, incredibly gripping. They're not super fast-paced, like action-heavy books, but there is a lot of politics, there's a lot of intrigue, and a lot of character development and exploration especially. So yeah, I definitely recommend Realm of the Elderlings. If you're looking for something with animal companions, very much fits the bill, and they are just magnificent books. So please read. Next up, we have a young adult fantasy series by a much beloved author. That would be The Immortals by Temeraire. This is the first book in this quartet, Wild Magic. In it, we follow Dane, who has always had a knack for animals, and especially horses. She generally prefers the company of animals to humans. And then she discovers that it's not just a knack for animals. She does actually have magical abilities to communicate and kind of influence animals. Throughout the books, she meets different animals, and they're always very important to the plot. And it has been years since I read these, but I have reread them many times over the years. It's been a while since I last did it, but I read these the first time when I was a teenager, and I reread them several times after. Now, Temeraire has some different fantasy worlds where she writes in. This takes place in Turtle, which also has many other books set in that world. And this is not chronologically or by publication order, the first one. This is where I started because I saw it and I read the description and it was all about animals and animal magic, and I wanted to read that. So I started with this, and then I moved back to like the first that was published, which is the Song of the Lioness, which is like the first books published in Turtle, but there are books chronologically that take place before. And while they do focus on different characters, there are a lot of characters that you will see throughout the series that you will meet again and again, just in smaller parts. The others are also great books, so I see no problem recommending starting at like the beginning by publication order. This is just where I started, and this fits with the animal companions, and I do love, like, this is my favorite quartet. There are both some quartets, there's a duology and a trilogy, I think, and this is my favorite set in this world. Next up, we have probably the most famous fantasy series in newer times, at least. That would be A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. And now most people have at least a vague idea of what this is about. A lot of people have seen the show, even if they haven't read the books. But this is epic fantasy set in a world where we follow many different characters and a lot of like political machinations. In the way of magic, it's quite low fantasy. There's not a lot of magic, and it doesn't take up a lot of space in the story. It's much more focused on the characters and like the political schemes and how they're all trying to best each other in the Game of Thrones. But there is one specific magical power that I'm definitely focusing on for this video, which is warging, which is essentially the power to go into the minds of animals. And again, if you're familiar with the show, you probably know one Stark kid that has this power. The thing is, in the books, they all do. It's more subtle for some of them, and it's not mentioned as much. We don't get POVs from all of them, so it's kind of offhand mentioned, but it's definitely implied that they all do, and it is more important for several of the characters in the book than it is in the show. In the show, they do have their direwolf companions. They're much more important in the books than they are in the show. If that's something you find interesting, you can definitely check it out. Of course, we can't forget the role of the dragons in this story. I just personally resonate more with wolves, or direwolves in this case, so that's why I'm drawn more to them than I am to the dragons, but they are definitely also an integral part of the story. So I would definitely argue that yes, animal companionship is quite important in A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, of course, remember that this is not a finished series, and whether or not we'll ever actually see a finished series, I don't know. Let's just say the last book number 5, came out in 2011, so that's 14 years ago. There are 2 more books planned. No idea if we'll ever get them, so be aware of that before starting the series. You might never get an actual ending to it, but they are very good books, even so. Next up, we have a middle grade young adult fantasy series that is not nearly as well known, I think, and that is Chronicles of Ancient Darkness by Michelle Paver. This series is set in a Paleolithic, like Stone Age setting, and in it we follow Torak, who is 12 at the beginning of this series, and he has just been orphaned by a demonically possessed bear at the beginning of the story when he finds a wolf cub who has also recently been orphaned, and then he bonds with this wolf cub, and they end up like having to fight the evil that's infecting this forest that they live in. I would say there are several things that I love about this series. Torag and Wolf just one of them, but their bond and how they grow together over the years, because they start out both basically as kids, right? And then they're growing. I just love that. And it's definitely a highlight of this series. I also think that this series is incredibly well researched, and Michelle Paver has put a lot of work into learning how things were done in this time period, both like how things were crafted, like for example, how boats were crafted, also about different cultures from this time period, as well as a lot of research into animal behavior. And I think it really shows in these books on all counts. I find it incredibly interesting to read for that as well. So it's kind of like there's an element of like historical fantasy, even though it is set in a made-up world, but a lot of it is actual like historical practices and things like that. Very interesting. I read the first 2 books in the series many years ago as a teenager, and then I didn't get around to finishing the rest of the series until last year, but I still very much enjoyed it, even though I'm more than 30 and this is written for a younger crowd. Very enjoyable still, so I highly recommend them. Another very well-known series, which very recently got a new addition to it, is The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. This, of course, follows Aragon, who finds and hatches a dragon egg. Now, dragon riders and dragons used to be much more common in this world until Galbatorix, the evil ruler, decided that he wanted to be the only one and rule everyone. So now Aragon and Saphira have to hide and flee for their lives so they don't also get killed. Now, this series is known for having relatively obvious influences from other fantasy works. I'll admit I haven't read it since I was younger, and if I reread it now, maybe there are things that I would notice, given that I've read much more fantasy since then, but I definitely enjoyed them back then. Christopher Paolini also started writing these when he was 15, which is insane to me. I do recall kind of struggling with the last book in the series. If I recall right, it had some bloating and pacing issues, which is not uncommon in final books in popular series, but I do still think that the series is worth giving a shot at least. There's a movie adaptation from like 2006 that is not worth giving a shot. It basically feels wrong to call it an adaptation of this book because they took almost nothing except for like names and then changed everything else almost. But I do think that there is, okay, remember right, there's a TV show like in the works. As far as I know, there's no like contract yet, so they're still in that phase. So the actual series is way off, but hopefully they will do a better job adapting it than the movie did back then. But I definitely think these are worth giving a shot. Now, I've mentioned wolves and dragons several times in this. Now we're going to move to a completely different animal with this young adult series that I love a lot, and that is Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan. In this, we follow Will, who is 15 at the beginning of this book and has just been chosen to become a ranger's apprentice. Now, rangers are very mysterious. People don't really know what they're about, so there's a lot of rumors of them using dark magic and other things to do what they do. But Will quickly finds out that they're actually like protectors of the kingdom and they have a very important role. And then he gets much more into his new apprenticeship, despite the fact that he always wanted to be a knight, even though he's quite small compared to his peers and kind of knew that it was a long shot. During his training to become a ranger, Will is introduced to his highly trained, highly intelligent ranger horse, who is actually a pony, but let's call him a horse, named Tug. And Will is not impressed at all, but he does soon learn better, and he quickly begins to bond with Tug, earning him a very loyal companion. I love these books in general. I cried several times the first time I was reading them when I was a kid. I've reread them later as an adult. I still really enjoy them. When I first read them, I went so far as to order the next books from Australia, even though I was living in the US. But they only had the first 3 books out in the US. John Flanagan is Australian, so they were published in Australia first. So I had to pay a lot in shipping to get them shipped from Australia to the US because I had no patience and I needed to know what happened. And there are many things I love in the series. Will and Tug is just one of them, but I definitely love their bond. Just to give an example, mild spoiler warning, in one of the books in the series, Tug and Will get separated and Will kind of has to work to get Tug back, and that resulted in something that I almost never do. I can't recall basically any other book where I've done it, but I started skipping some POVs. So from the point that they got separated to the point that that was resolved, I skipped every chapter that wasn't Will's POV, and then after it got resolved, I went back and read the other chapters. That's how anxious and worried I was about this pony that I did something I basically haven't done before or since. And I feel like that says a lot. Now, I haven't read past, I think, the 10th or 11th book. There are more books continuing on that, as far as I know, shift main character, and sometimes are called Royal Ranger series, I think, and sometimes are just like continuation of Ranger's Apprentice. And I haven't read those. So if you have and you think they're great, tell me, because I would definitely be down for reading them. I just never got around to it, I think. But I definitely recommend these books. I also got several of my family members to read them and they also love them. And yeah, They're really good. And I love Tug. He's the best pony. Now, the last recommendation I'm going to mention today is another dragon one, but in a slightly different vein. And that would be the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik. This is a historical fantasy set during the Napoleonic Wars, where in this series, dragons exist, and they grow to be quite massive, to the point that they are basically crewed like they're a battleship. So they have this, like, they put this harness on them, and then people like running all over, and it's very fascinating. And we follow Captain Will Lawrence from the British Royal Navy, who ends up recovering a dragon egg and becoming companion to Temeraire when he hatches, and is then moved to the Royal Aerial Corps, as they're called. Will is not happy about this switch in the beginning, but he ends up really bonding with Temeraire and changing his tune a little bit. So other than Will and Temeraire, you also get this crew that proves Temeraire. It's a weird sentence, but it's true. And they were following them in the Napoleonic War. And I am not enough of a history buff to say whether they're like following the actual events or if she's changing things. I don't know. So if you know a lot about the Napoleonic Wars, you might know what's coming or spot things. It's like, hey, that's not what happened. Other than, of course, dragons being there. Of course. But I think it's very entertaining and it's very enjoyable following both Will and Temeraire, like, as they bond and as Will learns more about dragons and this whole thing, but also like the events of the war. And in the following stories, in the following books, they also go some other places. Now, I've only read 3 books. I think it was originally like a 3-book trilogy, and then it ended up being 9 books in total, the series. And I do plan to continue. I just never got around to continue. Like earlier, I can't necessarily recommend the entire series, but the first 3 books at least I found very enjoyable. So that was all of my animal companion book recommendations. I hope that some of these sounds interesting to you and they maybe inspire a future TBR pick for you. If you have any recommendations or think there are any books that I left out, please tell me in the comments. I could definitely see myself doing like a part 2 at some point with more recommendations, as this is kind of a favorite of mine. Either way, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I really hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time. Bye.